Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our lecture. Delighted to welcome David Green. He is a local man, he's an ex-student, and he's, I think he's got quite a few friends in the audience, so expect it to be a little bit more lively from the point of view of the tick-tack of the question and answers. I'm sure David will be delighted to take questions from people who know him well as people who don't. We will open the chat line, so if you'd like to sort of start putting some questions in, that would be great, and we can look at those once David's finished his main lecture. But delighted to welcome you, David, and looking forward to hearing what you've got to tell us about the Age of Wellbeing. So I hand over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully we're on full screen now and everybody can see a good shot of the presentation. Thanks, Andrew, for the invite. I'm very proud and pleased to be presenting back at my former school. Just to sort of tell the story, I'm an ex-student and sixth former. In fact, I was saying to Andrew earlier, I was part of the first sixth form, which I think was in about 1981. I think somewhere around that sort of time. So yeah, part of the first sixth form. And just in case, I don't know whether you can see or not, but I've actually got a chipped tooth, and there's a story to this because I actually chipped my tooth in Portland Block many years ago, obviously while I was at the school, and my cap fell out very recently. So yeah, I've got a chipped tooth if anybody does notice. My name, as Andrew says, David Green. My business is called Improve On, and I offer wellbeing consulting, coaching, and speaking. And this lecture is based on my recently published book, The Age of Wellbeing. So here's the book, and you can see the front cover on the screen. My interest in wellbeing began around 10 years ago when I read the book Flourish by a gentleman called Martin Seligman, and I thoroughly recommend it. But he's the former chairman of the American Psychological Association, and he was also a pioneer in something called positive psychology. Now, it struck me at the time that well-being was an umbrella for all the things I'd really learned to that point in my life. So I became increasingly interested in it. And over the last 8 years, I've been devouring books, videos, research papers, looking at surveys, massive online open courses, basically anything I could get my hands on to improve my knowledge and expertise in the area of well-being. And that culminated in me writing the book. Now, why did I call it The Age of Wellbeing? Well, we've had the Industrial Revolution, and we've also more recently had the Information Age. And I fully believe that the next step in human evolution is to enter the age of well-being. And what I'd like to do tonight is share that thinking with you. So I've got 3 really core objectives tonight. The first is to help you understand well-being better, and a little bit more around well-being. The second is to convince you of the focus or the need to focus on well-being in order to meet some of these key challenges that we face as a human race. Thirdly, I'd like to give you some tips on how to improve your own personal well-being, but also the well-being of others around you. So without further ado, let's carry on. So first part, what is well-being? I'll give you a second just to read the slide. Okay, so let's break this definition down. Many definitions focus on well-being as just being an individual thing, just something that's personal. And of course it is. It is about the quality of our lives. But well-being is complex. Everyone's different, and yet we're all the same. And to give you an example, we know that understanding our values individually is good for us, but it's good for everybody. But the difference is that values will be unique to you as an individual. So there are certain things we know that, where we're all the same, really. In balance with other people, Well, this is where the definition becomes slightly broader than many definitions I've seen. Well-being is individual, but it's also collective. So your well-being will influence the well-being of people around you, and you both give and get well-being. And the last part of the definition recognizes that our flourishing is reliant on other species and the planet. If our ecological systems break down or the planet degrades, it's fairly obvious that our personal well-being will be diminished. So one of the things I'd like you to take away from this presentation is that we're all interconnected. You know, well-being works at an individual, an organizational, community, national and international levels. To take that a little bit further, what I present in the book is my own CANBE model of well-being. And the CANBE model consists of 8 well-being domains. Or if you like, imagine a map out in front of you at the moment with all the territories of your life mapped out there, interconnected. So these 8 domains are mental well-being, which is our thinking. It's emotional well-being, which is about how we feel. Physical well-being, which is, you know, about our actions and our behaviors. Spiritual well-being, which is about our beliefs, character, personality, all of these things come into spiritual well-being. Social well-being, which is understood to be one of the biggest contributors to our overall well-being, is about our relationship with people around us, our communities. And cultural well-being is more about the way we do things. So there'll be a culture at Litchfield School, as well as there would be in the country as a whole, or even the organisations in which you work. Environmental well-being, which is not just about the climate, but it's obviously the spaces around you. So you will, you know, the environment around you at this moment in time will be affecting your well-being, as well as the climate and the planet as a whole. And the last dimension is economic well-being. It's clear that we need our economies to, you know, bring us trade, to bring us the goods and services that we need, and that does all improve our life. Economic well-being is about.
Sorry, it doesn't matter.
I think there's somebody who's not on mute at the moment. I don't know whether is that, are we all good? Okay, carry on. So all of these 8 domains, they remain consistent whether we're looking at this from a personal, organisation, or even a national level.
So you've given up.
Okay, so if those were the territories of our life, then how do we know how well we're doing in each of those areas? Well, this brings us to the well-being states, or indicators, if you like, and they are thriving, they're struggling, they're surviving, they're striving, and they're surviving. So each of these different levels that we can be at any point in time in our lives. So for example, it's okay to suffer sometimes, but we need to learn to suffer well so that we can move back to thriving. Now, when we look at well-being, whilst we can compensate for low well-being in one area with high well-being in another, the highest levels of well-being are achieved when we get greater balance across all of those domains. So this is a great starting point to look at your own well-being and understand, you know, where you might like to improve and where things are going well for you, where things might not be going so well. And at the end of the presentation, I'll send you a link to a survey where you can look at that in a bit more detail. Okay, so if those 2 things, the domains that we have and the indicators, give us a picture of our own well-being, then we also need to understand, well, what can we do about our well-being? And that brings us to the dimensions, or highways. If you like, these highways help us cross the territories. And they're the things, they spell out CANBE, they bring the name to the CANBE model. So what are these then? Well, creating meaning. And again, this harks back to the things that we all benefit from. This benefits all of our well-being, regardless what meaning is for you. So creating meaning is making sense of the world around us and understanding why. And this gives us more motivation and reason. We all like to achieve our potential. Achieving stuff makes us feel good and helps us to build confidence. I mentioned earlier, we're social animals, and nurturing relationships by giving and getting support is one of the biggest contributors to our well-being. But of course, in life, things don't always go the way that we want. And you know, by building resilience, we can adapt better to the ups and downs. Lastly, enriching lives is about serving something bigger than ourselves. It's recognizing that well-being isn't just about us. So that's the CANBE model. And to support this, which is a lot of the research that I've done, is well-being factors, or if you like, these are signposts. So we've got our map, we understand how we're doing, we need to know how we get across these territories, and then there are signposts that sit between the intersections of the domains and dimensions. And these are the sort of things that help us understand what we can do to improve well-being. So to take just one of these, if you look at the way we think in the top left of the box there, that's at the intersection of mental well-being and creating meaning. Now, the way we think impacts on all aspects of our well-being. So if we can improve the way we think, we can improve our well-being. Within the book, there's lots of information about each of these words that shows and gives examples of what we can do to improve. Okay, so that brings us to the full CANBE well-being model. If you like, the top half provides us with a picture of well-being, and the bottom half provides us with things we can do to improve our well-being.
Don't see who's in it.
So,
you always have to do something when you sit with me. You always have to do something when you sit with me.
If that's what well-being is, why do we need to focus on well-being? What are the problems and opportunities driving the need for change? So it's clear if we focus on our personal well-being, that's a good thing. We can improve the quality of our lives. But the well-being story is bigger than that. So how does it relate to these bigger problems? Well, life today is better for many of us. There's less war, there's less famine, and for many of us, we're more comfortable than we've ever been. However, since the Industrial Revolution, we've been going off course, and we need a correction. Perhaps one of the best examples of this is a guy called Richard Easterlin. He did some research with the USA several years ago now that looked at gross domestic product, the wealth of the country. So the wealth of the USA was improving massively. But what he found was that there's no correlation with that in terms of people's happiness and well-being. In fact, in some cases, people's happiness and well-being was going down. More recently, there's been a lot of research in this area around well-being to understand, well, how does that all add up? Okay, so where have we been going off course, and what are some of the problems and opportunities before us? I'm going to look at this across the eight domains that I've already presented to you. So good mental, emotional, and physical well-being is the ability to manage our thoughts, feelings, and actions so we can respond effectively to the ups and downs of life. If we're thriving in these areas, we'll probably be creative, calm, and full of energy. But if we're suffering, we'd be maybe more distressed, highly strung, and drained. So what's happening in the world today? Well, what we know is that lifestyle diseases are now amongst the leading causes of poor health worldwide. And that's driven by our diet, by sedentary lifestyles. So sitting is the new smoking, but also by mental health. Mental health is a global problem now. Stress, anxiety, and depression are amongst the leading causes of ill health and disability worldwide. In fact, it affects almost 10% of the world's population. But we also have problems in this area around hunger and obesity. So the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations reported in 2017 that approximately 11% of the world's people were still undernourished. But on the other side of that, and a staggering fact, is actually there are more people that are obese in the world now than are actually going hungry. So it's the two-sided coin here. Moving on to spiritual well-being. So Good spiritual well-being is based on things that relate to our spirit or our soul, if you like, such as our purpose, character, personality, beliefs, values, and motivation. If we're thriving spiritually, we're likely to feel fulfilled. Whereas if we're suffering, we'll be unfulfilled. So what's happening in the world today? Well, perhaps one indication that we're going slightly off course is our continued focus on consumerism and materialism. Consumerism is the unbalanced promotion of consumer interests, and materialism is us valuing things over experiences. And two indicators of this are perhaps Black Friday, when some of us act more like a pack of wolves trying to get the latest products and services. But Earth Overshoot Day is the day each year when we pass the point of consuming more resources than the planet can replenish. Now in 2020, that was actually August the 22nd. And we also have this belief still, I think, that success is linked to fame and celebrity and influencers and billionaires. And we see those people as successful rather than people that focus on well-being. Social well-being. Well, this is based on our ability to establish connections and to relate to and maintain positive relationships with other people. If we're thriving in this area, we're likely to feel engaged with our relationships. When we're suffering, we might feel isolated. And as we know, even with the information age and social media, more and more people are feeling isolated. But what other indicators do we have in this area? Well, trust. This information is taken from the Edelman Trust Barometer. And what it shows is that there's real challenges to trust across the world. And trust is pivotal to healthy relationships, whether a person, group, or institution. And what Edelman Barometer shows us is that trust inequality is growing between what are called the informed general public and the mass population. And that we're also losing faith in leadership across national government organizations, the government itself, and media. People are shifting their trust to the relationships within their control. And in particular, my employer is becoming a mainstay of trust. So much so that trust, or rather only 1 in 5 people now really believe that the system is working for them. And this is being driven and exacerbated by the pandemic, by the 2008 financial crash, increasing immigration, corruption, fake news. We've seen high-profile hacking and data breaches, and obviously more recently, the threat of automation on our jobs. What about cultural well-being? Well, this is about living our lives in the way that we want to, in balance with other people. And it's based on things like inclusion, diversity, and integration. Culture includes our traditions, religion, art, technology, governance, food, language, all of these things. If we're thriving, we'll feel like we're in harmony with those around us. But when we're suffering, we may experience more conflict. So what's going in the world culturally? Well, we're living in a VUCA, yes, that's a VUCA, I said. We're living in a VUCA world. And what does that mean? Well, there's more volatility, which is the V, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this is leading to new skill requirements and demands on education. So as automation and the robots start to take over some of the more mundane and routine jobs, the human skills of empathy, creativity, caring, and compassion will become so much more important. And this is going to lead to regional shifts in employment and changes to jobs. There's going to be greater burden on welfare, social, and political systems. On the positive side, it's estimated that 90% of the world's information has been created in the last few years. And there's more breadth of information now. So mobile technology puts so much knowledge in the palm of our hands. You know, we can do so much with mobiles, which is fantastic. And the depth of information is also so much greater. Scientifically backed developments informing new approaches to the way we think and understand all areas of life are really helping us. So for example, we've mapped the genome And there's loads more research coming out about well-being and telling us what makes a good life and happiness. Environmental well-being. So this is about the quality of our life based on the two-way impact between us, our spaces and places, other species and the planet. If we're thriving, we'll feel an affinity with our environment and we'll be sustainable and circular economy, that type of thing. If we're suffering, well, we may be degrading the environment for other people, species and the planet. So what's going on here at the big level? Well, this is no surprise to anybody, but climate change is hitting harder and sooner than projected. And although greenhouse gases are due to or projected to drop in 2020 due to the pandemic, they're expected to return to at least the same or higher levels as things get back to normal. The climate change is affecting every country on every continent, affecting our economies and lives. Weather patterns are changing, sea levels are rising, weather events are becoming more extreme. Now, linked to this is biodiversity loss. Human activity has wiped out 2/3 of the world's wildlife since 1970. And a more recent UN report in May 2019 said that nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. We also have water scarcity. 1 in 7 of the world population lack access to water. And actually over 1/3 suffer from water scarcity for at least 1 month each year. Even modern cities like Cape Town in South Africa are suffering from water shortages. And only last week, I was reading in America, in the western states like California, they're very worried because of low water and rainfall during the winter, and that's going to put pressure on them in the summer. To the extent that the UN reports that water shortages could affect about 5 billion people by 2050. Now in 2050, that will be about half of the world's population. We also have limited resources and unequal access to them. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in a recent report, said, unfortunately, material stock accounting data are not readily available. Now, what that means is we don't know what's in the cupboard. The report goes on to say, in the absence of new policies, global material use will almost double from 2017 to 2060. So we don't know what's in the cupboard, but we're going to use more of it. It doesn't add up. If you're managing your household, you know that just doesn't work. On top of this, more recent EU Commission report said that access to resources is a strategic security question for Europe's ambition to deliver the Green New Deal. They go on to say in that report that global competition is becoming more fierce, and that's the word they use, fierce, for resources. So this sort of language makes you realize that actually the world does have finite resources and we need to use them more sparingly. Economically, well, economic well-being is about the two-way impact between what we give and what we get as a result of our career, trade, or what we do. Of course, it's also at the global macro scale about our markets and economies. If we're thriving in this area, we'll feel prosperous. And if we're suffering, we'd feel destitute. And unfortunately, there are far too many people towards the poor end of that scale. But what's happening on a global level? Well, what we know is that overall world's population at the moment is 7 billion, and by 2050, it's expected to approach the 9 billion mark. Now, that will be sporadic across the globe, and certain countries are seeing population falls. But the point is, we'll have a larger and older population, which will raise questions like, how do we support people into retirement and with long-term care? On top of this, we're seeing increasingly that people are moving from the country to towns and cities. In fact, the UN says that 68% of the world population is projected to live in urban areas by 2050. This is only exacerbated by mass migration. We're seeing mass migration driven largely by war, economics, and obviously climate change also. Another thing in this area is the unequal distribution of wealth and well-being, and the gaps are growing bigger. That's the point. They're not getting smaller. These gaps are growing bigger. What we know is that with this bigger unequal distribution, it leads to a lack of sense of fulfillment and self-worth, and this can, lead to more crime, disease, and environmental degradation. So to give you a few examples, let's take income as one. It's astounding to know that 2,000 billionaires own the equivalent of 60% of the world's population. When we look at gender, all problems are increased for women and girls by the virtue of their sex. On a health perspective, we've got humanitarian crises with refugees and migrants in Yemen and Syria. And we also have global unemployment rising. On a positive side, I think there are rising levels of consciousness. I'm going to talk about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in a moment, but we're seeing increasing levels of activism. People understand what's going on. We've seen Extinction Rebellion, and particularly amongst young people, we're seeing young people rising up with louder voices. But there are also well-being measures being adopted by governments across the world. You may have heard, I don't know, that New Zealand has adopted a well-being budget, and Scotland and Wales and Iceland are other countries that are looking at well-being. In fact, we do even have in the UK our own well-being measures, but there's less focus on them. We're also seeing growing media coverage of well-being. So, not wishing to paint too pessimistic a picture, because I'm optimistic about this and I believe that we can work our way through these problems, but we are in a point of inflection where we're either going to suffer, survive, or thrive. And unfortunately, our current direction of travel is taking us to the wrong end of this spectrum. We need action at international, national, community, organizational, and individual level. But the window of opportunity for change is slowly closing. The best framework that we have so far is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if you were at last month's presentation, you would have heard a presentation by Professor David McQueen from Bournemouth University, who talked about these goals and some of his optimism for them, but also his disappointments in that we haven't achieved them. There's 17 goals focused on economic, environmental, and social improvements, and they're stepping stones to a better world. I support them, but I also have several challenges around them. And in the book, I talk about how well-being can build on them. One of the challenges I have is that they're not really visionary. Is sustainable development what we really aspire to? I think David, in the previous month's presentation, talked about the fact, and many of the audience weren't aware of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's one of the reasons that people aren't engaged, is that we're not really, so what does sustainable development mean? It's not really individual or personal to me. The other thing is that the goals are very survival and problem focused. So to give an example, if you look at the second goal on the screen there, you can see zero hunger. And that's an admirable goal. But as I presented to you earlier, we actually have problems on both the undernourishment, but also obesity side. So perhaps a more opportunity type focused goal would be nutritious diets for all. The other thing is that these goals, I think, are targeted more at nations and institutions rather than individuals. So in the book, I try to introduce language that helps us understand how we can contribute to these goals, but from a well-being perspective. These goals are also less focused on the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual elements of our lives that we're really going to need to adapt and change if we want to achieve these goals. So my view about them is I support them, but I do believe that well-being complements and helps us build on these goals. So those were the first two parts. We've understood well-being better, and I've hopefully tried to convince you why we all need to focus on well-being. But what can we do in each area to build on our personal and collective well-being? I'm going to give you one idea in each area in the next few slides. But there are lots and lots of things that you can do, and I'm more than happy to talk to you after this presentation if you're interested. What I've tried to do in these slides is research tells us if we want to change a habit, one of the quickest and easiest things that we can do is attach one habit to another. So if you're already doing something and to change that very slightly, that's a good way of changing habits. Research also tells us that habits take time to change. So if you do try one of these things and it doesn't work immediately, please keep persevering. Okay, so what can we do? Well, I mentioned the mental health problems that we have in the world, and one thing perhaps that we could do is to be more present and mindful. Now, on each of the slides, it's a quote, so I'm going to give you a second to read the quote. Okay, so by being more present and mindful, my hope is that we can reduce stress and anxiety. So choose an activity that you currently do, and that could be exercise, it could be walking, it could be brushing your teeth, something that you know is already a habit, and just be totally present for it. Use all of your senses. If your mind starts wandering, as quite often our minds do, to what's going to happen later or what's happened in the past, just gently bring your mind back to that present moment. For example, just be more mindful about your breathing from time to time. Okay, what can we do in the area of emotional well-being? Well, how about being a better listener? This builds on what I said earlier about, how can we build trust, and how can we also, help people that are perhaps, suffering a little bit mentally. Again, by being a better listener, we know that we can reduce our own stress and anxiety, but also build perspective, about other people's problems. Sometimes we get a bit too inverted and think just about ourselves. This one's pretty obvious, really, but in the area of physical well-being, exercise is known to improve all areas of our life, from our mental well-being through to how we feel, and obviously how we feel physically as well. And this is linked to the reducing obesity and protecting the National Health Service, which is really important now. So again, just take a moment to read the quote. So one thing you could do here is just build more exercise into your daily routines, and that could be housework or taking the stairs instead of the lift. It could be just walking more, or if you're more ambitious, you might want to take on a challenge like couch to 5K. There's plenty of things out there. Spiritually, I'm a coach, as I mentioned earlier, and it's amazing to me that many of my clients, when asked about values, don't really know what their values are. How about writing down what's important to you in your life? Again, read the quote. By understanding our values, we can really know, by knowing what's important to us, we can sort of test, well, how's my life in accordance with that? Am I living it the way I want to? Is it causing tension? And start to unearth those gaps. Socially, I mentioned previously levels of trust falling and isolation. So what can we do in this area? Well, how about connecting with a new person? So you might like to connect with one, a pen pal, a neighbor online, or a club, or how about reconnecting with someone that you haven't spoken to in a while? Culturally, well, I mentioned this VUCA world and the requirement that there will be for, more human skills in our jobs going forward, with creativity, caring, and compassion. So how about learning a new creative skill, and perhaps even from a skill from a different culture? Excuse me. What we also know from research is that learning something new is good for us. Growing is good for our well-being. Environmentally, well, we talked previously about all the issues in the environment. Well, be in nature, and I've emphasized the be there, which I'll talk about in a second, but why not read the quote? So often, some of us perhaps don't get into nature enough, but when we do get into nature, it's easy just to walk and think about, let your mind wander, as we were talking about earlier, to other things without really being in nature. What a lot of scientists tell us is that actually we've lost our love of nature, and that's one of the reasons they think that we're not as proactive as we could be in protecting nature. So by falling back in love with nature, by perhaps taking a daily walk, gardening, or volunteering in a local environmental project with somebody like Dorset Wildlife Trust, we can really build that love back up for nature. And there's lots of evidence that shows that being in nature is good for our health. Lastly, economic well-being. Well, we talked earlier about population growth and the unfair distribution of wealth and well-being. So we're going to need to do more with less. So how about being more thrifty? Now, thrift doesn't mean save, save, save. If you look at the word thrift, it actually means it comes from an old Norse word, which means to thrive. So there is an element of carefulness to it, but it's also about avoiding waste. So where can we avoid more waste? But also it's about foresight and looking to the future. So where can we save and invest wisely for the future? Again, take a look at the quote. Okay, I said that there were three main aims with this presentation. The first was to help you understand well-being better. The second was to convince you that actually it's a good thing that we all focus on well-being. And what was the third? I've forgotten the third. I've forgotten what the third, whatever the third was. I think that actually, if we focus on well-being, we can all build a world where we can all thrive. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and if anybody's got any questions, I'm more than happy to take them.
I'll ask a question, Dave.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier, you said that you were actually quite optimistic about where we are. So what gives you that, or most of that optimism? What key things do you see or indicators that make you so optimistic?
That's a really good question, Andy. You know me as an individual. I'm a fairly optimistic person anyway. Hopefully, I'd like to think that through this presentation, I've sort of given hopefully a balanced view. So there is some optimism. Well, I do see that there is a sort of shift in, like I mentioned, the raising of consciousness. I think there are more and more people are understanding the need to sort of make a stand here and do things differently. At the moment, I think our leaders are perhaps letting us down in this area, but I think we haven't got any other choice really, unless we want our children and grandchildren, not so much our children, but the grandchildren. We have a duty, don't we, to leave the planet and leave things in a better way than we found it. So I think the choice is probably a good reason that we need to do things differently.
Thanks, that's great.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's a good answer, Dave. Yeah, and yes, you are. You've always have been, and you are a very optimistic person, and it's something I admire, to be honest. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, David. Can I ask, from the point of view of schools, what more do you feel that schools could do to improve students' well-being? There are obviously pressures on schools, with the accountability that comes with it, and the pressure for students to take exams. We can offer mindfulness, but if it's compulsory, what does it replace? Does it replace a maths lesson, or these kind of? What do you think schools should be doing more of and less of?
I'm very, very glad you asked that, and I almost feel like we've had a chat beforehand, and I've got you as a stooge, Andrew. But actually, I did anticipate that might be a question. So within the book, I actually present a vision of what well-being in education might look like, and an old story through to a new story. So on the screen, you'll see what I believe education might look like. Now, I don't take any credit for this, and I'm no expert in education, Andrew, but what I've done is researched. There was a book written by, and I forget the name of the authors now, but it's very much, and you'll know this, based on Finnish education in Finland, and that's put forward as a model of education across the world. But I also read a book around the area that looked at well-being, and what it says is that, you know, this old story is that schools are a conveyor belt providing workers for industry, and it's very much education derived from the needs of the Industrial Revolution. And what we need is education to become more of a think tank, producing change makers for a better society. I also think a lot of so if you go back to the slide that I showed in terms of some of the signposts, so I think we can work with children on thinking, you know, just if we look at thinking and how that can impact on education, helping children to understand the difference, for example, between ruminating, so when they make a mistake, you know, ruminating on it and letting them, you know, getting down about it. And though rumination has been linked with high levels of mental health issues and depression, and reflecting, which is a different thing, which is talking about looking at something, but then learning and moving on. So I think there are all sorts of topics within the CANBE model that I present that could be used by schools to take forward in education. The other thing I'd like to point you towards is the Youth Trust. Very recently, there's been a report by the Youth Sports Trust, and they're working with Bupa, looking at bringing well-being into education. And in fact, they did a survey that said that actually what parents want for their kids in school is very much more of a focus on well-being. So that, you know, to create these better citizens. So I won't talk more about that because there's more, but hopefully you can see on the screen that there's lots of ideas about how education can move forward in terms of well-being. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
That's lovely. Thanks, David.
Happy to talk more about that, and I'm happy to work with you if there's things you want to take forward in the school.
There's a question in the chat line, which is, can you just remind us the name of the author of the book Flourish?
Yeah, the guy is called Martin Seligman.
Oh yeah, yeah, lovely. And Katie's got a question.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, yeah, I'm interested in what you're saying. I teach a wellbeing and resilience program for young people, particularly focused on wisdom and resilience. And but my question to you is, who should pay for wellbeing education for young people? Because schools don't have it in their budgets to pay for specifically for wellbeing and education. If we want to have young people that thrive, flourish in life, these are lessons that can be learned early on when they're open to new ideas, and they can go out into the world with an understanding of everything that they have and that they're capable of doing. But if there's no budget for wellbeing education, it kind of leaves us stuck at that point. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very big question, isn't it? And this is where it does become. I mean, again, within the book, I talk about well-being almost being a leveler. It isn't supposed to be political. So if we look at research, so what I'd point to within the book, I've done a lot of research around fairness, and fairness talks about needs and merits. And from that perspective, I think all children personally should be given an opportunity to have the same education, and that isn't what happens in this country at the moment or many other countries. So my own personal view is that, you know, I'd like to see, you know, an education where all children could be have free education. That I don't believe children should be paying for university education. I think education is an investment in the future. So that's my personal view. There is also, for those of you that are listening that are very interested in this topic, and I've just signed this petition, but there are movements for a well-being economy, and the well-being economy is an economy that would put well-being at its heart instead of gross domestic product, i.e. wealth. So that's the essence of it. I can provide you with a link with that. So if you email me at david@improveon.co.uk, I'm more than happy to share that link with you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. By that token too, I also believe, coming from education background myself as well, not saying that schools like Litchett, I think, does do this as well as they possibly can, but why can't education, well-being, be at the heart of education? Because learners who have high levels of well-being learn well, and it's kind of like the wrong way around, isn't it? If well-being becomes the add-on,
Yes.
it's not supporting the whole mission, which is to you know, raise whatever it is I saw in the headmaster's introduction letter on the website the other day, you know, well-rounded contributing young people who can make the most of their lives, not only for themselves but for the benefit of other people around them. So it's almost like a shift change from putting well-being as a thing we do extra to well-being being the very core of which I know is something that Litchett values.
Well, that's exactly my belief, and that's the belief I put forward in the book. I think we need to focus on well-being at all levels of society. My question, I posed the question to the audience: what is life about? And I guess you might put forward the, you know, love as one word, but for me, I mean, love is wrapped up in well-being. I honestly believe, like I said, when I read the book 10 years ago, you ask questions, well, what is success? What does success mean? And for me, I've come to realize that for me, success means greater well-being. And I think if you ask yourself the question personally, what do I want? And you keep going with those sorts of questions, you'll come back to, at the heart of all this sits well-being.
Thanks, David. Sally McCarthy's got a question for you.
Sorry, I tried to type it in and then I lost it, so I'll say it instead. Many of the threats to our young people's well-being is happening outside the school gates rather than inside. What are your thoughts on, well, especially social media, but how do we keep our children safe and teach them the value of well-being when there's so much going on outside the school?
Well, this is why I think we should focus on well-being carte blanche across all of these different levels. You know, we do need to take personal responsibility. I think, you know, this isn't about a big brother state that, you know, we need to take personal responsibility for our well-being. I think parents have a big role to play. I'm not sure we're investing enough time or effort in ensuring that we get good parenting. And one of the things I put forward in the book is, look, we can't just refocus education on well-being and then leave education to it. What we need is, you know, businesses and governance and all of these things to change and focus around well-being, and it won't happen overnight. You know, this isn't going to be boom, you know, we suddenly all change, but I do think that if we focus on well-being all around, then the issues that you talk about would start to diminish. Does that answer your question sufficiently, or did you want more from me?
Thank you. Well, it's a big old job, isn't it? That's the issue. It's yeah, and it's everyone. I like what you say about businesses. It's a, you know, it's a bigger job.
One of the things I mentioned in the book, and this is where it becomes really challenging, and it's challenging for me to present on it because well-being is such a big topic, and I've struggled with it myself because it is so big. But one of the points I make is we need to start thinking more systemically. So you can't just, like I just said, you can't just take one. So let's take universal basic income. There are more calls for whether we should put in place a universal basic income, i.e. everybody gets an income regardless of who they are at a certain level, almost as a welfare type state support net. But I think what we do is we always take that one thing and we then say, well, will it work or won't it, without looking at the big picture. And what I try to encourage through the book is say, look at the big picture first and understand all the connections. And that then answers your question, I think, about, well, what do we do outside of education with that? We need to look at parenting. We need to look at technology. We need to look at all of those things and consider them all in the round to then be able to sort of give our children, you know, a better chance at well-being.
Thank you.
David, it looks as though you have answered everyone's question in your highly informative and thought-provoking presentation. Very grateful to you for that, and I'm very grateful also that you've allowed us to record this, because I'd like a lot of our students to hear what you've said this evening, and that will enable us to to give students access to it. So thank you ever so much for speaking. I'm very interested, and I know Sally works on well-being in school, as every teacher does, of course, but we may well like to invite you into school if that's all right, because I think our students would really benefit from hearing you speak live, and hopefully that will all happen from next year, let's say. So,
yeah, pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me. And just to say, I will send out an email. I think you've agreed kindly to send an email on to everybody with a few more links, and if anybody wants to talk to me, one of the things I am interested in is actually setting up a group within the local area. So if anybody's interested in that, please get in touch.
Great. Well, it's been a really interesting talk, and thank you for the questions to the audience. And we will certainly meet again, David, and thank you very much for this evening. So thank you for those of you